So good morning, everyone. Obviously, thank you for joining us nice and early today. I appreciate some of you just coming from breakfast, some of you just grabbing a coffee. So appreciate the nice early start to be here with us. My name is Holly Francis. I'm the marketing manager here at Adam Matthew Digital. Obviously very pleased to be with you here this morning to introduce you to our session, which is bringing primary sources into the classroom. How can publishers, librarians and instructors collaborate to further primary source pedagogy and literacy? Really excited to be joined by a fantastic panel this morning who are going to take us through our session. So first of all, I'm joined by my colleague, Ellie Davey Corrigan, who's a publisher here at Adam Matthew. Ellie works within our development team and has helped bring a number of projects to market, including research methods, primary sources, which actually just launched this week. So very exciting time for us. Ellie's going to be speaking a little bit about the research we've recently undertaken around the topic of teaching with primary sources and the challenges that are faced by librarians and instructors and even students. We're also very excited to be joined by Robin Katz, who is a librarian at the University of California, Riverside. Robin's going to be speaking a little bit about her professional interest in teaching with primary sources. And I'm also delighted to say that we're joined by Sarah Sussman. So Sarah is Head of Humanities and Area Studies and Curator of French and Italian collections at Stanford University. Sarah's going to be speaking this morning around how subject librarians at Stanford teach primary sources and the impact of the pandemic. We have got a little bit of time at the end for questions, so please do submit those in whatever form is easiest for you. We've got a bit of time to go through those at the end, so submit them as we're going through and we'll try and get to as many as we can. And with that, I'd like to hand you over to our first speaker today, Ellie.
Thank you, Holly. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. Bear with me 2 seconds. Sure, it will be seamless. Can everyone see that? Yes? Excellent. I'm just going to stop my video because I've got some slight connection problems, but you can still see the rest of my lovely panel. So thank you, Holly. Thank you, Robin and Sarah. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you on this session. The purpose of this panel is to talk about collaboration, share experiences on how primary sources are used within teaching and learn from each other about how students engage with archival content. We're also looking to the future in readiness for a more hybrid world and how digital resources can better support virtual learning environments. We are entering an exciting transitional period at Adam Matthew, and I'm going to take the next few minutes to present the findings of a survey we've been conducting over the last few months that will inform some of the new directions we're taking. As you may be aware, this week marks the release of our new teaching platform, Research Methods for Primary Sources, a major departure from our core programme of primary source databases, actually. It's a pedagogical resource which gathers together all of the tips and knowledge that students need to understand how scholars evaluate primary sources. And Holly's going to tell you a bit more about this later. And Robin and Sarah are also going to tell you about how these tools and similar that they've used at their own institutions have come into play in the last 2 years. Research methods came out of years of conversations with librarians and instructors that exposed a need for practical tools for students to develop their own toolkits for improving their primary source literacy. The platform is a truly collaborative achievement with over 200 professional historians, teachers, researchers, librarians and archivists, all contributing content and sharing their expertise. We are alert to more opportunities to build upon this type of practical and interactive resource, and the survey that we conducted over the last few months and this conversation today are just the start of many more initiatives and activities we're going to be embarking upon. The survey was designed to gather feedback on 4 core areas under the theme of librarian, faculty and publisher collaboration on how to bring primary sources into the classroom. And we sought feedback on how students currently engage with primary source material, physical and digital, what instructors and faculty need from us as publishers of primary source content to support digital primary source literacy, how we can develop our resources to enable deeper and more critical connections with primary sources, and how the pandemic has affected teaching, learning, and access to library resources, and the impact this will have on the future teaching landscape. And in the next few slides, I'm just going to share some of those findings. We wanted to hear at a fundamental level librarians and instructors' perspectives on student knowledge and understanding of primary sources when they enter further education. Just over half of respondents felt that most of their students had a good sense of what a primary source is when they start their courses. However, there was a common thread in the responses that understanding of primary sources can tend to be surface level. Many said their level of understanding, engagement, and capacity for critical thinking with primary sources was limited. In particular, responses suggested some students struggle to discern the difference between a primary and secondary source. This feedback mirrors conversations we had as we began developing research methods and led to some of the very practical features and guides in the platform to introduce students to these types of materials. We also asked what students enjoy most about working with primary sources. This is perhaps a basic but a really critical question for us. It's integral to how we develop our resources, how can we ignite and nurture students' passion for historical research through interaction with digitized sources? How can we build our databases to present archival material in a way that leaves space for students to develop their critical thinking skills and forge their own research paths, but within a framework for understanding that aligns with the instructions they're receiving in the classroom? The results show a fairly balanced response on what students say they enjoy most, but the top 3 responses came through again and again throughout the rest of the survey, actually. First-hand connection, ownership of fresh research, and a sense of academic rigor. And there's a quote that really stuck with me, which I've popped on here. It's when using primary sources that students really grapple with what it means to do history. We asked what are the most effective types of primary sources for teaching students in the classroom and their own research. The survey said that the most effective types of documents was personal manuscript material, correspondence and diaries, AV material, and interestingly, objects and material culture. Newspapers followed quite quickly, but I thought those top 3 were particularly interesting. Whilst most popular, manuscript material was also acknowledged as presenting some of the biggest challenges. It was difficult to use in the classroom, and the level of skills for reading cursive handwriting really varies. The bottom-up approach that this document gives works best outside of lectures, is what our participants told us, whereas AV material and objects are often most effective for studying in the class and in creative discussion groups. We asked specifically what methods instructors use to introduce students to primary sources and the skills that they gain. Deep questioning came through time and time again. Students must ask questions of the sources, often most effectively in group scenarios. Critical thinking analysis developed through asking these questions was the consistent response about the skills that students gain. To measure their understanding, faculty use assignments that compare and contrast sources. They told us they want students to find a balance between individual assessment and rooting the sources in secondary literature. Cross-referencing sources helps them develop arguments. And this information is important for us in many ways, in the types of documents, how we present them, how we add functionality for interaction in the classroom and group settings. A core part of the survey was to understand how we can complement the symbiotic relationship between librarians and instructors and between the classroom and the archive. We asked about the nature of collaboration at our respondents' institutions, and the most cited answers to our questions on the support librarians are asked to provide were instructing students in the library on how to find sources and helping faculty discover resources and collections for their classes. We asked faculty and teachers what's most important to them when using databases to teach primary sources, and respondents really took their time to give us detailed examples, telling us what they do and don't need. What we've heard is that students can find archival material overwhelming and intimidating, and some instructors told us they want to be able to easily assign thematic source sets to give students a starting point to conduct their own research. Our resources and the teaching tools we offer are not designed to replace expertise of instructors, but it's our responsibility, they told us, to make the documents discoverable and create platforms that are easy to navigate. On a practical level, we were given an example of a barrier faced by students in using their most popular material types, the manuscript documents. The ability to read these, the paleography skills that aren't accessible at all levels, really were obstacles. We are really proud of our handwritten text technology that makes handwriting searchable in our resources, and we're actually working on the next phases of functionality to make them even more accessible. So the sort of feedback that we're getting here and we've had in the past is really critical to ensure we invest and innovate in the areas that are most needed. Additional detail flagged AV material as some of the easiest and most engaging sources in the classroom, which is something we're paying attention to. Throughout the survey, a clear message came through, which we're listening to. What do publishers need to do and improve? Pay strict attention to provenance, transparency, and context. All of the decisions we make in the course of developing our resources is under the guidance of academic experts and library professionals. We have asked deep questions of our resources and are committed to making visible a diversity of voices. In all our resources, we understand it's critical to contextualize the collections, highlighting the stories that are present and those that are not. And everyone was clear that context is key. Faculty told us that when helping students develop their own critical, independent voice, they must know the provenance of the source, situated in time and place, and understand how it fits in the historiography. And finally, we asked about how institutions have fared throughout the pandemic, both the positives and the challenges that have come out of that forced flip to virtual learning. We wanted to understand the impact that the pandemic has had on education. 80% of the respondents expect to retain an element of virtual teaching, and they cited a really wide range of positives and challenges with this. Many see an opportunity here to enhance physical teaching going forward, but not as a replacement. Some of the challenges and benefits that came out, as we come out of the pandemic, we are acutely aware of the lasting impact it will have on the classroom. We are committed to making sure our resources are fit for purpose in this new hybrid world. And as we said at the beginning, research methods heralds a turning point for us. And as we're thinking about how we create more infrastructure in our resources to support teaching, it's absolutely vital we ask our users and our partners what that teaching will look like after 2 very turbulent years. Thank you. I'm now going to pass to Robin.
Thank you, and I am going to share my screen. Okay. Can we see okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Good morning. So a little bit about me. Hold on one sec. Okay. So I was trained in archives and special collections, and I led a 3-year U.S. Department of Education grant called Students and Faculty in the Archives, where I was lucky enough to get to focus on instruction hands-on with archival collections for 3 years. In 2013, we launched this site, teacharchives.org, full of sample lessons, articles on pedagogy, and practical how-tos. Oh, okay. There we go. I was invited to be on the task force, which authored the guidelines for primary source literacy, and we worked from 2015 to 2017. One key thing about this is that that document was by archivists and special collections librarians, and we were asked to focus on higher education, but we wrote it to be about any materials, personal collections, social media, in any setting for primary sources. Around that time, I was already starting to experiment with my own teaching. Instead of taking a promote my own collections perspective, I was trying to meet the needs of faculty and students and use whatever materials they needed to be used. That sounds simple, but honestly, for a lot of us special collections librarians, that's just not how we're organized in terms of our libraries and not how our training encourages us to work. I started to teach more with circulating collections, the open internet, even the built environment, and subscription databases. And honestly, subscription databases were one of the weaker choices when it came to my teaching. In 2017, just after completing our work on the Joint Task Force and getting what's an equivalent to tenure in the UC system, I made a pitch to my institution to become the world's first primary source literacy librarian. In 2018, the 2 professional organizations that sponsored the guidelines for primary source literacy adopted those guidelines. These are organized around 5 areas for broad general objectives. Instructors need to turn these ideas around conceptualizing sources, finding and accessing them, understanding and summarizing them, being able to use them and evaluate them into actual measurable specific learning outcomes. And I'm actually currently working on a workbook that will be a useful tool for this. Over the last several years, honestly, over the last decade or so, there has been an emergence of the teaching with primary sources community among librarians and archivists. And there's been a general consensus that we need to move away from the old way of doing things, the show and tell, toward active learning. The Research Methods Primary Sources database, when Adam Matthews contacted me about it in early 2020, I was very excited because, as I mentioned, databases in the past haven't always been that useful in my teaching. Adam Matthews is known for high quality materials and sources, but I thought that this product in particular fulfilled several needs that I saw. It would be useful for institutions without collections of their own, and many librarians are at places that don't have special collections and archives to really draw from. Even when you have your own collections, they're always limited in scope. And even with large and diverse collections, depending on the context of what your audiences need, a tool like this could actually add a lot to the conversation. And so I felt like this is what had been missing for most subscription databases. Now, post-COVID, of course, the idea of electronic resources being utilized in the kinds of teaching with primary sources instruction that I do is much more accepted and much more useful. And I think moving forward, we're going to see less resistance to using digitized materials, more of a demand because of the possibilities for scale, and just an interest in really hybrid forms of learning as well. So the things that I'm really excited about with research methods, primary sources, are that the case studies are generic. I authored one on oral histories generally, but using one source, one oral history in particular, to really walk students through step-by-step, model that document analysis that are those skills that we're trying to build when it comes to primary source literacy. And it especially does a great job, the way that the case studies are structured, in encouraging students around what questions to ask of the source and in their process. I will be very interested to see how libraries and faculty incorporate this tool into their teaching. I suspect that teaching and liaison librarians will need to really highlight the features of the database and make concrete suggestions to faculty on the usefulness in order for it actually to be adopted and kind of reach its full potential. I wonder whether students will discover this resource on their own through A to Z database lists and things like that, or library promotion, and whether students will be able to use it on their own to any effect. Many of our databases at most of our institutions honestly go somewhat underutilized. And because the aims of this product are more pedagogical than just pure collections, I'm curious to know what kind of metrics and measures we might use to indicate success. But I look forward to seeing how it goes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin.
Let's see. There. Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk today about our experience at Stanford teaching with primary sources, and especially how we've pivoted during the pandemic. And I thought I would start with a few questions to frame this presentation. The first is, how do subject librarians teach primary sources? And how do we incorporate digital resources into our instruction and outreach? And finally, how did the pandemic impact our practices? And how will it shape our collecting and services going forward? So at Stanford, I will focus on Green Library, which is the main campus library and home to the Humanities and Social Sciences collections. It's where I, as a subject librarian, live, and it's also where the Department of Special Collections and University Archives is located. Now, Stanford differs from many libraries in that most of our subject specialists are also curators who do subject collection, general collection in our areas, and also select and provide services and lead instruction sessions in special collections. In these sessions, primary sources are presented as a way of inspiring interest, a means of expanding students' perspectives, as sources of data that can be analyzed and computed, and as building blocks of research. So we really do want them to become researchers. We define primary sources as evidence that is created both by the content and by the context in which they were created. And our goal is to turn the students into scholars who examine the content, put it into context, question the materials, and approach them both as individual items and as part of a larger story. We want them to see how materials may challenge or deepen their understanding of the neat narratives that they are learning in their courses. From 2016 to 2019, I was among a group of curators who worked with one of our history professors on a project called Massively Multiplayer Humanities. We called it MMH. This was a program that addressed several problems that we faced in teaching in special collections. Most classes that visited special collections were small seminars, upper division or graduate seminars. And we wanted to be able to scale up primary source teaching to accommodate larger introductory lectures and provide guidance to TAs so that we could ease the work for both special collections, public services, and the curators. We put together a 2-session workshop for grad students to teach them to run courses in special collections that fostered active engagement with primary sources. And we wanted to go beyond the show and tell visit that Robin mentioned and have the students themselves interact and engage with materials. The workshop included a brief behind the scenes visit to special collections, a presentation by the head of preservation on materials, safe materials handling, discussions about primary sources and archives, and demonstrations on how to discover archival materials and primary sources in online catalogs. The workshop culminated in a hands-on simulation of a class where each grad student had to set up and lead the class to their peers, who then provided feedback. And after completing the workshop, the students were deputized to lead courses in special collections and could TA for introductory lecture courses that had been designed to incorporate these types of activities. So in pre-pandemic times, our special collections by subject librarians or by the rare books curator, and sometimes by faculty or TAs was the norm for teaching. But during the pandemic, things shifted, of course. And like other institutions, Stanford's teaching moved to an entirely digital format, with students attending classes from around the world. Remote teaching not only necessitated the use of primary sources in digital format, but it also raised awareness of the richness of these digital materials. Before the pandemic, the databases supported teaching and research on an as-needed basis, and most often they were just a serendipitous discovery by the students, or we mentioned them, the subject librarians mentioned them in one-on-one sessions. But once we moved to remote learning, the contents and the accessibility made them essential teaching resources. So during remote learning, our curators shared physical materials live by camera feed as pre-recorded videos or with digital images. Sometimes these were just iPhone snapshots taken very quickly on quick visits to special collections during the shutdown. But the physical qualities of the sources, which we emphasize in our classroom teaching, were absent. The services weren't really scalable, and the students lost their agency in the classroom. But we had been fortunate that we had been acquiring digital primary sources at the same time as we were focusing on the unique collecting, and we could realize both the short-term and long-term benefits. So I'll give 2 examples of how Stanford instructors used these digital materials in their remote learning, in their remote classes in the 2020 academic year. When faced with online teaching, one history instructor set up her whole class around the London Lowlife database, even titling the course London Lowlife in the 19th Century. The instructor set out a set of questions for the course, and the students used the London Lowlife collection to learn to use primary sources to come up with more questions, grapple with their expectations, and to develop a historical narrative. The broad scope of the resource meant that the students could follow their own interests to find relevant primary source materials for their assignments. And since all the materials in the database were sourced from established archives, students and their instructor could have confidence in their selections. Furthermore, the instructor wasn't limited to a small number of published primary sources that needed to be distributed to students, didn't have to worry about copyright issues, the cost of a reader to students, or their access to the physical library. A second example is another history class on modern Britain and the British Empire. While this course was not built around a specific primary source database, its topic aligned with many of the collections: the Mass Observation Archive, the Foreign Office files for the Empire, and Confidential Print Middle East. Students came up with their own topics and then approached the subject librarian to match them to relevant digital resources and to instruct them on how to best find materials and analyze materials suited to their project. The fact that these were even available allowed primary source teaching to continue in a meaningful way. So now we're back on campus, and we hope that the incorporation of these primary source databases into classroom teaching will continue. And I think that this is what will happen. Special collections teaching has ramped up again, but the accessibility and functionality that the resources offer, the increased familiarity of everyone with online research, and the true richness of the materials that they offer mean that we expect both individual and course use to increase. So I'll include with an example from just last week. I've been preparing with several colleagues a series of visits to special collections for a course on global commodities. And when I mentioned the global commodities database to the instructor, she responded by sending out an email with a link to the students, and she offered this comment: perfect time as they begin to explore possible artifacts and allied research materials. So there's no requirement to use it, but a strong encouragement to explore it. I might go further than that in another year, but I need to explore it further myself. So looking forward to the future, this is what we might see. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Some really interesting initiatives going on there between Sarah and Robin, and hopefully we'll get some good questions on those. So of course, do feel free to drop those into the chat either here or through Pathable. We've got some time at the end for those. I'm just going to show you a brief video which kind of brings together a lot of what we discussed today, a lot of those kinds of topics. So fingers crossed it works. We've heard today throughout this presentation how librarians and instructors have tackled the challenge of introducing their students to primary sources, both before and during 2020, as well as how things have changed more generally. How do students find primary sources, either through online collections or in the archive? How do they evaluate them once they've located them? And how do they apply them in their own research as historians? Using feedback such as this from instructors around the world, we've created tools within Research Methods Primary Sources which help answer these sorts of foundational questions in an engaging and interactive way. Whether that's an examination of the key concepts in historical study, practical guides to research, the types of archives students may encounter in the course of their own research, how to understand and use these different types of archives, or fundamentally, how to use primary sources. Looking back at the survey we recently conducted, I wanted to take one question, a fundamental question, which asked, how many of your students know what a primary source is when they start your course? Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly for some, only half responded to say most understand what a primary source is when they begin. So here we have a tool, a short animation with transcript, which answers the question, what is a primary source? Once students have that understanding of what a primary source is, and some context around how historians and researchers use primary sources, It's possible to build on that strong foundation, and one way you could do this is with case studies showing examples covering a range of source and research types, such as oral histories here, where I'd like to just jump in and show you an example of a case study that's been written by Robin. Here you'll see about the author, in this case Robin Katz, who we've heard from today on the topic of developing primary source literacy skills in students. You'll see the learning outcomes associated with that case study and a range of other areas covered here. With an understanding of what a primary source is, how to locate them and how to evaluate them, what better than an opportunity to put those new skills to the test, which can be done here in our practice sources section. Here we have an example of an advertisement. I'm going to look at this one from Brillo Manufacturing to show you an example of a practice source. Here you'll see the summary, the source itself, and the metadata related to that source. Hopefully this has demonstrated how Adam Matthew has used research and feedback from those around the world instructing on primary source literacy and usage, such as today's panellists, and how we've used that to create tools which provide support in this aim. So thank you all. So we now have about 10 minutes for questions, if anyone wants to submit any to anyone in our panel today. So just keeping an eye on what we've had through.
So we've had one.
Okay, I can read our first question. So Judy asks, why do you think journal articles, subscription content are not popular as primary sources with students? And that's a question, I guess, directed at me, but I think others can answer also. So I guess when I was talking about databases, I was thinking specifically of databases of primary sources, not necessarily of secondary journal articles. Those are certainly popular and often taught somewhat well by instruction librarians. I was thinking more about comparing subscription databases of primary sources compared to the open, free digital collections that many cultural heritage organizations put online through their own institutions or aggregator sites like the Digital Public Library of America. And so those are easier to find because you can Google them. And so that's why students find them easier and kind of gravitate towards them more. And on the instructor end from the library or the archive, we professionals are more used to our own cultural heritage organizations and what we put out, as opposed to what the publishers have put out, with some exceptions, like some newspaper databases are fairly well known by certain subject area librarians and that kind of thing. But that's a broad brush, and that's been my experience. So I'll let our other panelists chime in if they have thoughts too.
I agree with you actually about the newspapers are a very accessible primary source for the students. And especially I think for undergraduates in the US, at least, we're always looking for things that are in English that they can read and engage with. So I think one of the things that that came up this morning also is the importance of context. And some of these curated databases, they're either, from an archive and sort of replicate the archive by series and, the same organization as the physical archive, which is great, or they're sourced from a group of archives for a thematic reason, and so that provides also this context and a certain authority or understanding that these materials have been selected or that they come together. So it provides a bit more confidence, and I think that that's something important. And along with the metadata that describe it, to help both students find the materials, but also how they fit into this larger collection of primary sources.
I'd like to jump in too about the two examples you shared, Sarah, that global commodities connection to the class on coffee and sugar. is just such an amazing connection, but that's rare, you know, that there's a database that so perfectly fits the topic of a course. You know, it's very hit or miss when it comes to those really curated products. And then what we might want to see more of is that Lowlife example, where a teacher actually took this tool available to them and really designed around it. But that doesn't happen that often either. And that's really more of a faculty professional development or instructional design question.
Thanks, guys. So we've had a few more questions in. There's one for me, which I can answer very quickly, which is whether that what is a primary source video is available without subscription. Currently not, but I'm happy to reach out to you afterwards and see how we might be able to get you access to that. A few more questions coming in as well. I have some here for Robin and Sarah, I think, just quickly having a look through them. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep up on the messages that are coming through. A question perhaps for either of you, what partnerships have been helpful in developing content in the curriculum? No?
I was just reading Russell's comments. So Russell said that Russell is part of a consortium that has worked with National History Day. So I'm not sure I totally understand the context of what Russell is speaking about. I would see National History Day as like a potential audience for a library or an archive or a collection. So working with teachers and students, and usually it's in middle school and high school in the US, kind of around these National History Day projects, around the theme. That's a wonderful way. And again, from that special collections perspective of, this is a great way to get our collections out there and connect with people and promote their use. But in terms of the consortium developing curriculum, I'm not sure I understand that context. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I was just going to add that I think most of the time the partnership is more with the faculty and instructors that we try to encourage with the librarians and curators to make sure to try to organize sessions and try to get the students into the library and have these experiences, because once they do come in and see the materials or have access to the online materials, it sort of blows their mind often. It's such an effective way of getting them more interested in the topics.
And as a teaching librarian, I've worked with specific classes. So a middle school class doing their National History Day project with a really great motivated teacher who really expects a lot out of them. And so then we can position ourselves as experts who can help build skills or who can help point students toward finding those primary sources wherever they may exist on their topics. And their topics, vary greatly if you take one whole class in that way. And I would also recommend I've been a judge for National History Day. So for any of the folks in the audience, if you have any remote interest in using primary sources and you're able to locally volunteer as a judge, it's a great experience.
Thanks, guys. So we have about another minute if there's any more questions that anyone wants to put to our panelists while we're here.
There is a question from Michael. I don't know if you can see that, Holly.
No.
I can read it out. I'm assuming it's for Robin or Sarah rather than us, but perhaps we'll start off with you guys, and then if there's anything you can ask. We may get kicked out, I think, at 10 past. So apologies if that happens. Robin, over to you.
So Michael asked about the challenge of there being multiple vendors providing primary sources to students and students not having a single place to search for primary sources. And yeah, that's the problem, and that's where we come in as librarians and instructors, is we have to help teach students how to navigate that constellation of sources, collections, institutions, platforms, databases. It's not just one single search, and that's what research is.
Fantastic. That was a very quick response. Appreciate that, Robin. I think we're just about to run out of time. So I just wanted to say thank you to Robin and Sarah for your time today. Really appreciate you being part of our panel. And thank you to Charleston for putting on this fantastic conference. I know it's been a challenge in this new kind of hybrid environment, but really appreciate the opportunity to be here. And we're obviously happy to follow up with any questions afterwards. Anyone on the panel, please do reach out to us. with that, I think enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Robin and Sarah.
Thank you.
And I've heard there were a couple of people in the ballroom as well, so thank you so much for coming in person and sitting there. And we're very sorry we couldn't be there. There was a moment Holly and I thought we would be able to catch a flight at the last minute. It just didn't happen. But maybe next year. So thank you everybody who's attended virtually at a very early time in the morning as well.